So now we have another shaila, and the next shaila having to do with what we saw up until now is that there's a machlokas in the poskim when a person has a relative and he wants to be able to provide his tzedakah money to that relative. Can he do that exclusively, even if it means cutting back all of his charitable donations to public charity? And it seems from this responsum that we saw that it's a machlokes. According to the Chasam Sofer, a person should optimally divide his charity between his one, high priority charity and to the other community institutional charities. And according to Rav Moshe, the prerogative is for the individual to do as he pleases. And all of the priorities and that we see in halacha are really reserved for the Gabbai Tzedakah, which is a big chiddush from Rav Moshe, And so, and I think it's really a game changer when you think about the halachic ramifications. According to Rav Moshe, essentially, a person has full control over how he distributes his tzedakah money, and no one can say to him, you should be giving to one thing over another because it's a more important charity. Okay, so let's look at the next question. Reuven hifri shlosha sikumim shel kesef, ha'echad b'matara lechalek ba'atzmo la'aniyei hashchuna. So Reuven set aside three sums of cash. One was for the purpose of himself distributing to the poor of the community. In other words, he set aside a whole bunch of tzedakah money, bunch of coins that he was going to be giving out to the members of his own community. Hasheni limsor l'gabbai tzedakah shel hashchuna. The second sum of cash he was going to give to the gabbai tzedakah, like to give to the charity fund. V'hashlishi litzedakah b'stam. And the third amount he decided he's going to just leave over for general tzedakah as it comes up. Va'ata Reuven rotza latet chatzi mishloshet hasikumim livno shegar be'ir acheret v'hu zakuk le'ezra. Mahadin. And now Reuven has realized that his son is now living in another community, needs financial support. So even though he's already set aside these monies for different causes, for different charitable causes, he would like to take a significant sum of that money, let's say 50% of it, and now give it to his son instead. Does he have a right to do so? That's the question. So the tshuva is as follows. Legabe hasikum harishon shehifrish b'matara lechalek ba'atzmo la'aniyei hashchuna. He says, well, the first amount of money that he set aside, which had been set aside for the poor of his own community, lamrod shahadin hu shehu chayav lechalek oto bein aniyei hashchuna lefi seder hakidimot hamevuar b'shulchan aruch. Well, let's look at the priority list that is identified by the Shulchan Aruch. Aniyei ircha kodmin, the poor of your own city come first, right? Dainu kohen kodem lelevi v'chulei. That we know that there is a hierarchy. A poor kohen takes priority of a poor Levi takes priority of a poor Yisrael, and that's only when they're members of your own community. There's a whole priority system. V'chol zo to rashai lechalek mimenu gam kein lekrovav, ulam aser lo lechalek lehem mimenu yoter mechatzi hasikum. But he's still allowed to distribute a portion of that money to his family members, but he can't give more than half based on that Chasam Sofer that he had quoted. I believe it's quoted before. I believe that's what he's basing it on. Ulam legabe hasikum shehifrish kedei limsor legabai tzedakah shel hashchuna. So the 33%, the third that he had set aside for the poor of his community, he can take up to half of that and give to his son. And the reason why he's allowed to do that is because the son trumps even members of your own community. A relative trumps members of your own community. But what about the next chunk of money that he had set aside for the Gabbai Tzedakah, for the person in charge of distributions. Adinhu she'eno rashai latet mimenu likrovav afilu sikum kolshu. That you're not allowed to touch. Elohu chayav limsor kol oto sikum lagabai kupat hatzdaka shel hashchuna. But he must instead give it to the Gabbai Tzedakah of his community. V'hem yechalku lefi seder hakedima hamuvar b'shulchan aruch o keminhag hamakom imkayim minhag eich lechalek. And it's their duty to make the distributions according to sort of the objective standards of the community based on the priority hierarchy that is detailed in the halacha. And apparently the way he's looking at it is, since I've already sort of designated that this money will be going to the community, to the Gabbai no longer has to reckon with my son as a relative, right? And therefore I'm not allowed to touch any of that money. Ulagabe hasikum shifrish litzdaka bistam meikar hadin hu rashai latet hakol likrova v'lo sharoi latet chelek lisharaniim kamo shekotavnu la'el. As far as the final third that he set aside without designating what it's for, that technically he could give all of that to his son. However, it would be appropriate for at least a portion of that to go to other charities as well. So that's the psak. I'm just trying to see if right. Okay, so that's the final psak. But we'll take a look at some of the commentary to see what the basis of this is. So he says, Hine bo'or zarua, kasa v'zel l'shonim. So he quotes the Or Zarua in Hilchos Tzedakah, one of the Rishonim. He says, V'roa ani shahadvarim kal v'chomer. Uma ma'aser ani shahatorah zachsa la'aniyim v'chayif bal hasada la'aser afilo achi noten likrovav. He says, look at agricultural tithes, and we'll make a kal v'chomer. When you do an agricultural tithe for the poor, the Torah says you have to give this produce to the poor, but nonetheless, you are allowed to set aside the lion's share for your relatives who are poor. If that's the case, then certainly you have a right to give to your relatives first, but only up to half. Only up to half of your money may be distributed to your relatives before other poor. V'nira be'enai davka shehifrish hatzdaka kedei lechalek ben ani ha'ir u'ben aniyim da'alma az lamatzi litein la'niyei krovav ela lamar l'shita echas mechza u'lamar l'shita hashniya shnei chalakim. He says, this is all the text of the Or Zarua. He says, but it would seem to me that it's only when you set aside this money to distribute to the poor of your community or to the poor in general, then you cannot give to your relatives more than 50%. And there's another opinion that says 2/3. But if when you set aside the tzedakah money, you did not specify that you're giving it to the poor, but you just are setting it aside for tzedakah, zachu ba karov aniyim. In that situation, then you have a right to give it to your relatives without any kind of percentage taken off. Ki mistama kol hanotein tzedakah al das haTorah nosein. Because we can assume that this is what the Torah wants. The Torah places a priority on relatives over non-relatives. And therefore, because you did not set aside this money for the poor of your community or for the poor in general, but you rather set it aside just stam as tzedakah, the sort of the priority that's enumerated by the Torah or by the Chachamim gives you the right to give it to your relatives. V'od hol v'hu ashir rovim haniyim eno mutalim al hagabe shabeir lefarnesem ki im alav nimsa shazu hatzdaka shalahem hi hilkach heim zachu bo ad kan l'shana. He says, and furthermore, and I don't really understand this last line, really at all. But he's basically saying, since the person who is contemplating giving it to his relatives is a person of means, then it's his responsibility to take care of the poor of the community. And therefore, that tzedakah belongs to them. And therefore, I think what he's saying is you don't have a right to give more than half of what you had set aside for the poor to your relatives. Anyway, that's the end of the statement of the Or Zarua. That last sentence is a little bit ambiguous, but let's ignore it anyway. But this commentary from the Or Zarua is going to provide the basis for his dispensation of this psak, which is that it all depends on what you did when you set aside the tzedakah money. Which is obviously a good sort of caution to all of us. When we set aside tzedakah, the best thing to do is just to say it's for tzedakah, and I'll decide later what causes I'm going to be giving it to. Because as situations arise, you may discover that you have, let's say, a brother-in-law, a cousin, a child, maybe even a parent who needs tzedakah that was unanticipated when you set aside that money. And it would therefore be much more to your benefit and to the benefit of those people who are your relatives that need the money for you to set aside that money stam, so that you won't be sort of stuck, let's say, in a situation where you'll feel guilty giving it away since you already had set it aside for the members of the community. So it's always best to set aside tzedakah money, and only right before you are ready to donate it should you say what it's for. But the bottom line is, he says, "Lemeda mikan shebimatan tzedakah stam zachu krovav haniyim mishnei ta'amim." So he says, but based on what the Or Zarua says, that when a person sets aside tzedakah money without designating it at all, relatives have a higher right to that money, so to speak, for two reasons. Aleph, ki mistama kol hanosein tzedakah al das haTorah nosein, because since the Torah law allows for relatives to have a higher priority than non-relatives, it means that the Torah is sort of awarding it to the relatives. Umashma shalamrot sheyesh zechut kidima lakrovim mikol makom osa zechus eina mechayeves oso v'hadavar toloi b'ritzano b'sha'as haneder. He says, and that what that means is that even though the Torah wants your relatives to get that money, but if you had made a pledge beforehand that you're going to give that tzedakah money to other people, you have to commit to your pledge. V'lachein rakim nadar b'stam yitzarech latet hakol likrovav ki omdim daito shehitkavein lindor kifi ratzon haTorah. And therefore, we have to assume that if a person designated that money, he would have to give it to whomever he designated, and it's only if you just put it aside without making any kind of commitment that your relatives get that privilege. He's just really repeating himself. Number two, hoel v'hu ashir karovim ha'aniyim ena mutalim ala gabay shabir lefarnasam kim alav. So he's using this last sentence to explain as follows. He says, because I am a man of means and I have the wherewithal to support my relatives, I have an obligation to support them, and therefore they have a priority. And therefore, logic would dictate, based on that second argument, that even if he said he was going to give this to the poor of his community, but since I have an obligation to support my relatives, it could be that I would be obligated to find other funds to support my relatives, even when I've already committed money to other causes for tzedakah, which is, I'm not really certain how he's inferring it from those words, but I'll leave it at that for today. And I think that's where we're going to leave it. What I'll do is I'm going to send out the next packet we'll do the next Shaila, because I really don't feel we need to delve into this any further. And also what I want to do is I'd like to change our study after Sukkot. I want to go into a new Sefer in Choshen Mishpat. I think we've really gone into a lot of detail in this. I don't know that it's necessary for us to continue going, drill deeper and deeper and deeper into the Sefer. I'll print up one more set of 20 pages. I'll send it out in the WhatsApp. We'll do this until, I guess, Yom Kippur. We'll take a break between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Then after Sukkot, we'll start a new Sefer in Hilchos Choshen Mishpat. Okay? So have a